The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the nearly empty laundromat as Sheriff David Thompson made his usual late-night patrol through the quiet streets of Pine Grove. The small town, with its mix of old brick buildings and family-owned shops, usually didn't give him much to worry about after dark. But lately something, or rather someone, had caught his attention. For the past 2 weeks, he'd noticed a young girl, probably no more than 12 or 13, alone at Mason's 24-hour laundromat. Every night, like clockwork, around 11 p.m., she'd be there with an oversized garbage bag slung over her shoulder, methodically sorting clothes into the washing machines. At first, he tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just helping her parents with chores. But something about the way she glanced nervously at his patrol car whenever it passed by made his instincts kick in. 23 years on the force had taught him to trust those instincts. Tonight was different, though. The autumn air had turned bitter cold, and a light drizzle tapped against the laundromat's large windows. Through the foggy glass, he could see her small figure moving between the machines, carefully measuring out detergent like she'd done it 100 times before. Sheriff Thompson pulled his patrol car into the empty parking lot, the gravel crunching under his tires. He sat there for a moment, watching as the girl expertly transferred clothes from washers to dryers. She moved with purpose, checking the time on the old wall clock every few minutes. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of rain and fallen leaves. The girl froze for a split second, her hand hovering over the dryer's control panel. She wore a purple hoodie that seemed a size too big, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. "Evening," he said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Bit late to be doing laundry by yourself, isn't it?" She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mix of caution and determination that seemed far too mature for someone her age. I'm not doing anything wrong, sir," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "Just washing clothes." Sheriff Thompson noticed how she positioned herself protectively in front of the machines, as if guarding them. The garbage bag she brought in was now empty, but he could see at least 3 washers running behind her, each filled with what looked like a variety of clothing, definitely more than what one young girl would need. "Mind if I ask your name?" he asked, maintaining his distance to avoid making her more uncomfortable. "Annie," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Annie Brown." He nodded, glancing around the laundromat. Besides them, the only other presence was Mrs. Chen, the elderly owner who dozed in her small office at the back, a small TV playing an old gang show rerun, providing white noise to the empty space. "Well, Annie, I'm Sheriff Thompson," he said, pulling out his notepad more out of habit than necessity. "I've noticed you here quite a few nights now. Your parents know you're out this late." Annie's fingers fidgeted with the zipper of her hoodie, but her gaze remained steady. "My grandmother knows I'm safe," she answered carefully. Not quite a lie, but definitely not the whole truth either. The sheriff noticed other details now: the careful way she organized the clothes, the small notebook where she seemed to be keeping track of something, the multiple bottles of detergent lined up neatly on the folding table. This wasn't just some kid doing random laundry. There was a system here. As if on cue, one of the dryers buzzed. Annie quickly turned to open it, pulling out what appeared to be uniforms, the kind worn by nursing home staff. They were followed by several sets of everyday clothes that looked like they belonged to elderly people. Sheriff Thompson's suspicion began to shift into curiosity. "That's quite a lot of laundry for one person," he observed, watching as she expertly folded each item with careful precision. Annie's shoulders tensed, but then something in her seemed to decide that honesty might be her best option. She took a deep breath, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "They're not all mine, sir. But I promise I'm not stealing or doing anything bad. I'm just trying to help people who can't help themselves." The sincerity in her voice made him pause. There was more to this story, much more, and something told him that what he'd stumbled upon wasn't a problem to solve, but rather a mystery that might just restore his faith in humanity. "Why don't you tell me about it?" he suggested, pulling up one of the plastic chairs that lined the wall. "We've got time until those loads are done, and I've got a feeling this is a story worth hearing." Annie sat down across from Sheriff Thompson, her hands folded in her lap. The steady thrum of washing machines filled the silence between them as she gathered her thoughts. Outside, the rain had picked up, drawing wavy patterns on the windows of the laundromat. "It started with my mom," she began, her voice soft but clear. "She used to work at Pine Grove Community Hospital as a nurse. Every weekend, she'd bring home extra uniforms and scrubs from her coworkers who couldn't afford the laundry service. She said everyone deserves to feel clean and professional, you know." The sheriff nodded, noticing how Annie's eyes lit up when she talked about her mother. There was pride there, mixed with something deeper, a kind of sadness that no child should have to carry. But it wasn't just hospital uniforms, Annie continued, standing to check one of the dryers. Mom noticed that lots of older folks in our neighborhood struggled with laundry. Some couldn't carry heavy loads anymore, others couldn't afford the machines. So she started helping them too. Sheriff Thompson watched as she pulled out a stack of neatly pressed clothes, placing them carefully into different piles. Each pile had a small sticky note with what looked like an apartment number written on it. "Your mother sounds like she was quite a special person," he said gently, noting how Annie's movements slowed at the word "was." "She got sick last spring," Annie said, smoothing out a floral blouse that clearly belonged to an elderly woman. "It happened really fast. The doctors said it was an aggressive type of cancer." She paused, taking a deep breath. By summer, she was gone. The sheriff felt his chest tighten. He'd seen his share of tragedy over the years, but watching this young girl shoulder such a heavy burden made his heart ache. "After the funeral, my grandmother took me in," Annie explained, her hands busy with folding. "She works night shifts cleaning at the hospital, the same place Mom used to work. We get by, but it's not easy." A timer buzzed, and Annie moved to transfer another load to the dryer. The sheriff noticed how she checked each piece carefully for stains or tears, just as a professional laundry service would. "About a month ago, Mrs. Wilson from apartment 4B, she's 82 and uses a walker, she stopped me in the hallway. Asked if I knew anyone who could help with her laundry, like my mom used to. Her arthritis was getting worse, and she couldn't manage the stairs to the laundry room anymore." Annie's face softened at the memory. "I remembered how Mom always said that helping others was the best way to keep someone's memory alive. So I offered to do it myself. Word spread pretty quickly after that." Sheriff Thompson got up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked parking lot. He'd driven past this laundromat hundreds of times, never knowing the quiet act of kindness taking place inside. "How many people are you helping now?" he asked, turning back to face her. 23. Annie replied without hesitation, pulling out her small notebook. "Mostly older folks from the Pine Grove apartments. Some can't manage the stairs, others are on fixed incomes. A few are former patients my mom used to help." She flipped through the pages, showing neat columns of names and dates. "I have a system. Different days for different floors. I use my allowance and tutoring money for detergent and fabric softener." The sheriff's investigative instincts kicked in, but not out of suspicion. He was piecing together a different kind of story now, one about a young girl who'd found a way to keep her mother's legacy alive while helping her community. "Does your grandmother know about this?" he asked, already guessing the answer from Annie's earlier careful wording. She shook her head, closing the notebook. "I don't want her to worry. She works so hard already, and—" Annie's voice caught slightly. "I'm afraid she might make me stop. She says I need to focus on school and being a kid. But this doesn't feel like work to me. It feels like—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Like keeping your mom close?" Sheriff Thompson suggested softly. Annie nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes with her sleeve. "Plus, you should see how happy it makes people. Mr. Chen from 6A always brings me homemade cookies. Mrs. Wilson tells me stories about when she was a dancer in New York. And last week, Mr. Rodriguez gave me a picture his granddaughter drew to say thank you." The sheriff watched as she moved between the machines with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures and cycle times. Here was a child who'd taken a personal tragedy and transformed it into something beautiful, not for recognition or reward, but simply because she saw a need and knew she could help. As another dryer signaled its completion, Sheriff Thompson realized this wasn't just a case of a young girl doing laundry. This was a story about love, legacy, and the kind of quiet heroism that holds communities together. And he knew, right then, that his job wasn't to end this operation, it was to figure out how to help it grow. The next evening, Sheriff Thompson decided to follow up on Annie's story. He parked his patrol car outside the Pine Grove Apartments, a worn but well-maintained building that housed many of the town's elderly residents. The brick facade had seen better days, but there were cheerful flower boxes in many windows, signs of people who took pride in their homes despite limited means. He'd done some checking at the station that morning. Annie's mother, Grace Brown, had indeed been a beloved figure at the hospital. Nurses still spoke about her with misty eyes, describing how she'd go out of her way to help anyone in need. Her death had left a void in the community that, unknown to most, her daughter had quietly stepped in to fill. The sheriff pressed the buzzer for apartment 4B, where Mrs. Wilson lived. After a few moments, a crackling voice came through the speaker. "Who is it?" "Sheriff Thompson, ma'am. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Annie Brown." There was a pause, then the door buzzed open. The elevator was out of order, again, according to the handwritten sign, so he took the stairs, understanding now why laundry would be such a challenge for the residents. Mrs. Wilson answered her door wearing a bright floral housecoat, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Her walker stood nearby, and her apartment was small but immaculately kept. Family photos covered most surfaces, showing a life well lived. "Is Annie in trouble?" she asked immediately, concern evident in her voice as she gestured for him to sit down. "Because that child is an absolute angel. She's the only reason I've been able to keep my independence." "No trouble at all," the sheriff assured her, accepting a seat on a well-worn armchair. "I'm just trying to understand the full story." Mrs. Wilson's face softened. "Well, that's a story worth telling," she said, settling into her own chair. "You know, I used to be a dance instructor in New York. Taught for 30 years before my arthritis got bad. These days, just getting down to the laundry room is like climbing Mount Everest." She gestured to a neat stack of freshly laundered clothes on her dining table. "Annie brings everything back perfectly folded, better than the professional service I can't afford anymore. But it's more than that. She listens to my old stories, really listens, just like her mother used to." The sheriff noticed a small envelope on top of the clothes. "She won't take money," Mrs. Wilson explained, following his gaze. "I try to slip her a few dollars when I can, but she always puts it toward laundry supplies for others. Says there are people who need it more than she does." From Mrs. Wilson's apartment, Sheriff Thompson made his way through the building. In 6A, Mr. Chen showed him the special container of almond cookies he kept just for Annie, explaining how she reminded him of his own granddaughter back in California. In 5C, a retired teacher named Mrs. O'Brien talked about how Annie had helped her organize a system for washing all her quilting materials. Each apartment told a similar story of an elderly person finding not just practical help, but companionship in their young neighbor. They showed him thank you notes they'd written, photos they'd shared, small tokens of appreciation they'd given. Annie had created more than a laundry service. She'd rebuilt the network of care her mother had started. On the 3rd floor, he met Mr. Rodriguez, a former mechanic who now used a wheelchair. His apartment walls were covered with his granddaughter's artwork, including a crayon drawing of Annie hanging up clothes on a line, complete with a rainbow and stars. "My daughter works 2 jobs, he explained, adjusting his glasses. "She tries to help when she can, but Annie makes it possible for me to stay in my own place. Dignity, that's what she gives us." The sheriff's notebook filled with similar stories. Annie knew which residents needed their clothes separated by color because their eyesight was failing. She remembered who was allergic to certain detergents, who needed extra fabric softener for sensitive skin, who preferred their shirts hung up instead of folded. Small details that showed how much thought and care went into her work. In the building's small community room, he found a calendar where residents had started coordinating their laundry needs through Annie. They'd organized themselves to make her job easier, creating a schedule that worked around her school hours. Some residents who could still manage stairs had even started helping with smaller loads, inspired by her example. As Sheriff Thompson walked back to his car that evening, he passed the building's laundry room. The machines there were old and expensive to use, with signs warning about which ones to avoid. No wonder so many residents struggled with this basic task. Yet here was a 12-year-old girl who'd seen this problem and, instead of looking away, had decided to do something about it. He sat in his patrol car for a long moment, thinking about everything he'd learned. Annie wasn't just doing laundry, she was continuing her mother's legacy of caring for others, weaving together the fraying edges of their community one load at a time. But she was also just a child, carrying a burden that no young person should have to bear alone. The sheriff started his car, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Maybe it was time for the rest of the community to step up and help this remarkable young girl who'd been helping everyone else. A week had passed since Sheriff Thompson's investigation of Annie's laundry service, and the bitter autumn weather had turned even colder. The night sky threatened snow as he pulled into Mason's laundromat parking lot, right on schedule for his usual patrol. But tonight was different. There was an unusual stillness about the place. Through the foggy windows, he could see Annie sitting alone on one of the plastic chairs, her purple hoodie pulled tight around her. No machines were running. No piles of laundry waited to be sorted. Instead, she sat staring at a piece of paper in her hands, her shoulders slumped in a way that made her look even younger than her 12 years. The bell chimed as he entered, bringing with it a gust of cold air. Annie looked up, and the sheriff could see she'd been crying. She quickly wiped her eyes with her sleeve, trying to put on a brave face. "Evening, Annie," he said softly, taking the seat next to her. "Slow night?" She handed him the paper she'd been holding. It was a notice from the laundromat's management. Due to rising utility costs, washing machine prices will increase by $1.50 per load starting next week. Dryer prices will increase by $1 per cycle. "It doesn't sound like much," Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when you're doing 20 loads a week," she pulled out her little notebook, its pages now dog-eared from constant use. "I did the math. With the new prices, I can only help half as many people, maybe less." The sheriff watched as she flipped through the notebook, showing him careful calculations in her neat handwriting. She'd been tracking every quarter, every load, trying to stretch her resources as far as possible. "I tried to figure out a way to make it work," she continued, pointing to different numbers. "I thought maybe if I used cold water only, or if I packed the machines fuller, but Mrs. O'Brien's quilting materials need hot water, and Mr. Chen's work uniforms can't be cramped in too tight, or they won't get cleaned properly." She turned to a new page, where she'd started listing names in 2 columns. "I've been trying to decide who needs the help most. But how do you choose? Mrs. Wilson can barely walk, but Mr. Rodriguez's daughter just lost her second job. And Mrs. Lee's arthritis is getting worse with the cold weather." Her voice cracked, and she closed the notebook quickly. Mom never had to turn anyone away. She always found a way to help everyone. Sheriff Thompson noticed a small stack of cookies wrapped in cellophane on the chair beside her, clearly one of Mr. Chen's special deliveries. Next to it lay a child's drawing of what looked like angels doing laundry, signed in crayon by Mr. Rodriguez's granddaughter. "I haven't told anyone yet," Annie admitted, picking at a loose thread on her hoodie. "They all depend on this. Mrs. Wilson was talking yesterday about how she can finally sleep better now that she doesn't worry about clean clothes. And Mr. Chen said his boss noticed how professional his uniforms look lately." She stood up suddenly, walking to the window to watch the first snowflakes begin to fall. "Grandma's been working extra shifts at the hospital. I heard her on the phone talking about winter heating bills. I can't ask her for help." The sheriff joined her at the window, remembering all the stories he'd heard from the residents at Pine Grove Apartments. How this young girl's simple act of kindness had created a web of support and dignity for so many people. Sometimes, Annie said, her reflection barely visible in the dark glass, "I sit in Mom's old rocking chair and try to imagine what she would do. She always knew how to fix things." She turned to face the sheriff, and in her eyes he could see both the child she was and the adult she was too quickly becoming. "But I can't fix this. And if I can't help everyone, maybe," her voice trembled, "maybe I should stop helping anyone. It's not fair otherwise." Sheriff Thompson watched as she walked back to her notebook, running her fingers over the names written there. Each one represented not just a load of laundry, but a connection, a piece of community that Annie and her mother had helped build. Just then, the laundromat door opened, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in from her back office, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She'd been quietly watching Annie all evening, and concern lined her face as she pressed the cup into the girl's hands. "For the cold," she said simply, patting Annie's shoulder before shuffling back to her office. Annie wrapped her hands around the warm cup, and for a moment, the sheriff saw her mother's spirit in the gentle way she smiled at Mrs. Chen's retreating figure. Here was a child who had taken on an adult's burden, not for recognition or reward, but because she saw people in need and couldn't walk away, just like her mother before her. As he watched her sip the tea, Sheriff Thompson made a decision. This wasn't just about laundry anymore. This was about preserving something precious in their community, something that couldn't be measured in quarters or washing machine cycles. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for the community to wash away this young girl's tears the way she'd been cleaning their clothes, with care, with love, and with dignity. The next morning, Sheriff Thompson sat in his office, Annie's notebook open on his desk. He'd asked to borrow it overnight, promising to return it before her next laundry session. Now, looking at the careful records she kept, the names, dates, special instructions, and calculations, he felt even more certain about what needed to be done. He picked up his phone and dialed the first number on his list. "Morning, Pastor Roberts. Remember that community outreach program we talked about last month? I think I found the perfect place to start." Over the next few hours, the sheriff's office became a hub of activity. The local newspaper editor stopped by, followed by the high school principal. The owner of Henderson's Hardware dropped in during his lunch break, and Mrs. Powell from the quilting circle brought coffee and stayed for an hour, taking detailed notes. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff's whiteboard was covered with ideas, phone numbers, and action items. His secretary, Betty, had to start turning people away, telling them to come back tomorrow. Word was spreading through the small town, and everyone wanted to help. That evening, instead of making his usual patrol past the laundromat, Sheriff Thompson headed to the Pine Grove apartments. The community room was packed, standing room only. Residents from every floor had squeezed in, along with business owners, church members, and town officials. "Keep your voices down," Mrs. Wilson whispered from her seat near the front. "Annie's upstairs helping Mrs. Lee with her grocery delivery. She doesn't know we're meeting." The sheriff stood before the crowd, Annie's notebook in his hand. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Most of you know why we're here. For months, a 12-year-old girl has been quietly taking care of our community. Now it's our turn to take care of her." He told them about the price increases, about finding Annie alone and crying in the laundromat. The room grew silent as he described her struggle to choose who she could keep helping and who she'd have to turn away. Mr. Rodriguez wheeled himself forward. "My daughter's workplace might be able to donate some detergent," he offered. "They supply hotels, and they always have extra." "The quilting circle can help with folding and organizing," Mrs. Powell added. "We meet every Tuesday anyway." Hands shot up around the room as more people volunteered. The hardware store owner offered to look at fixing the building's elevator. The high school principal suggested creating a community service program where students could earn credit by helping. Pastor Roberts knew of grant opportunities for community improvement projects. Mrs. Chen, who'd closed the laundromat early to attend, spoke up from the back. "I talked to owner tonight. Maybe we make special rate for community program. Good business to help good people." The sheriff watched as neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before started exchanging phone numbers and making plans. Annie's small act of kindness had revealed connections they didn't even know existed. Mr. Chen raised his hand, speaking softly but firmly. "Annie's grandmother, she works so hard. Annie doesn't want to worry her. How do we help without causing problems at home?" The room grew quiet again. They all knew how proud and private some families could be, how difficult it could be to accept help even when it was desperately needed. Mrs. Wilson tapped her walker on the floor for attention. "What if we don't just help Annie? What if we make it bigger? A real community program, something that helps everyone. Annie could be our inspiration, but not our only helper." The sheriff nodded, picking up a marker and walking to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. "Let's think this through. What would a community laundry program need to succeed?" For the next 2 hours, they worked out details. The owner of the local coffee shop offered to provide free coffee and pastries for volunteers. A retired accountant volunteered to manage the finances. The newspaper editor promised to run a story highlighting the need for community laundry services without mentioning Annie specifically. As the meeting wound down, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Everyone froze as Annie's voice drifted through the door, chatting with Mrs. Lee about her grocery delivery. They waited in tense silence until the footsteps passed. "Remember," the sheriff said quietly, "Annie doesn't know about any of this yet. Let's keep it that way until everything's in place. We want to do this right." As people filed out, Mrs. Wilson caught the sheriff's arm. "You know what the most remarkable thing is? That girl thought she was just helping with laundry. She had no idea she was actually teaching all of us how to be better neighbors." Outside, the first real snow of the season was falling, coating the town in a clean white blanket. Sheriff Thompson stood for a moment, watching the flakes swirl in the streetlight. Tomorrow, he'd start putting all these plans into action. But tonight, somewhere above him in the apartment building, a young girl was probably checking her notebook, counting quarters, and worrying about how to keep helping others. Soon, very soon, she would discover that when you spend months weaving a tapestry of kindness, it has a way of wrapping itself back around you when you need it most. The transformation of Mason's laundromat happened overnight. Annie arrived at her usual time, dragging her heavy bag of clothes, only to stop dead in her tracks at the entrance. Through the windows, she could see the entire place had changed. New signs hung on the walls. Community laundry program. Together we care. The old plastic chairs had been replaced with comfortable benches and small tables. A coffee station steamed in the corner, complete with fresh pastries from the local bakery. But most surprising of all was the crowd of familiar faces inside. Mrs. Wilson sat at one of the tables, sorting clothes into piles. Mr. Rodriguez was there in his wheelchair, teaching 2 high school students how to properly fold dress shirts. The quilting circle ladies had taken over an entire corner, efficiently working through stacks of laundry while sharing stories and laughs. Annie stood frozen in the doorway, her bag forgotten at her feet. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward from where he'd been waiting near the coffee station. "Welcome to your new headquarters," he said softly. I don't understand," Annie whispered, looking around with wide eyes. "What is all this?" Mrs. Chen emerged from her office, wearing a new apron with the Community Laundry Program logo. "Special community rates," she announced proudly, pointing to the newly posted price list. "Half price for program washing, quarter price for seniors and disabled. Good business, helping people." Annie's hands trembled as she pulled out her notebook. "But how? Why?" "Because you showed us what community really means," Mrs. Wilson said, making her way over with her walker. "We've all been so focused on our own problems, we forgot how to help each other. You reminded us." The sheriff guided Annie to a chair as more people stepped forward to explain. The local hardware store had donated new folding tables. The high school's community service club had officially adopted the program, providing regular volunteers. Local businesses had set up a fund to cover supplies and reduced-rate washing fees. "But that's not all," Sheriff Thompson said, pulling out a familiar-looking notebook. A newer, bigger version of Annie's worn one. "We've expanded the program. There are now volunteer teams for each apartment floor. Some people help with washing, others with folding or delivery. The quilting circle handles all the special care items." Annie flipped through the notebook with shaking hands, seeing her careful system expanded and improved. Her small operation had grown into something she'd never imagined possible. "Your grandmother knows now," the sheriff added gently. "She came to us yesterday, worried about why you seemed so sad lately. When we explained everything," he paused, smiling at the memory. "Well, she had to sit down for a minute. Then she told us about your mother, about all the little ways she used to help people. She said you're just like her." Tears welled up in Annie's eyes as her grandmother stepped out from behind the folding stations. She was wearing one of the new program aprons and holding a framed photograph. "I found this in your mother's old things," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think it belongs here now." The photo showed Annie's mother in her nurse's uniform, surrounded by smiling hospital staff, all holding up freshly laundered uniforms. Below it was a small plaque that read, "Grace Brown Memorial Community Laundry Program, continuing a legacy of care." Annie ran her fingers over the plaque, then looked around at all the faces watching her, faces of people she'd helped, now here to help others. "Mom always said that helping people was like doing laundry," she said softly. "You can't just clean one thing and expect the whole load to be fresh. Everything needs care. And everyone needs help sometimes," her grandmother added, pulling her into a tight hug. "Even the helpers." The door chimed as more volunteers arrived. teachers from Annie's school, church members, neighbors she'd never even met. Each one had heard the story of the young girl who'd been quietly taking care of their community, and each had asked how they could help. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Sheriff Thompson said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "In fact, we need your help in a different way now. Would you consider being our program coordinator? You know more about organizing this than any of us." Annie looked around the laundromat. At Mrs. Wilson teaching new volunteers about sorting clothes, at Mr. Rodriguez sharing his expertise in stain removal, at her grandmother proudly hanging her mother's photo on the wall. This wasn't just a laundromat anymore. It was becoming exactly what her mother had always envisioned, a place where community and care came together. "On one condition," she said, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders. "Everyone gets help. No one gets turned away." The sheriff smiled. "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Sheriff Thompson pulled into the laundromat's parking lot for a very different kind of visit. The once faded building now sported fresh paint and flower boxes in the windows. A cheerful banner announced, "First Annual Community Care Celebration." Inside, the transformation was even more remarkable. The space hummed with activity as people moved between washing machines and folding stations. High school students chatted with elderly residents while sorting clothes. The coffee station had expanded into a small cafe area where community members gathered to share stories and pastries. Annie stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing traffic with the confidence of someone twice her age. She'd grown a little taller over the past months, but it was her smile that had grown the most, bright and sure, just like her mother's in the photograph that still hung on the wall. "Mrs. Powell, the quilting supplies are ready for inspection," she called out, checking something off her list. "And Mr. Rodriguez, your grandson's art class finished the new murals for the children's reading corner." The sheriff paused to admire the colorful walls where kids now did homework while their family's laundry tumbled in the machines. What had started as one girl's mission to help with laundry had bloomed into something extraordinary. The Grace Brown Memorial Community Laundry Program had become a model for other towns. 3 more locations had opened across the county. But more than that, it had changed how people saw their community and each other. "Sheriff." Annie waved him over to where she was helping a new volunteer learn the ropes. "Did you see? The college students finished their app. Now people can schedule pickups and deliveries right from their phones." He followed her to a small office, once Mrs. Chen's domain, now the program's headquarters. Charts on the walls tracked volunteer hours and services provided. A bulletin board overflowed with thank you notes and children's drawings. But what caught his eye was a small table in the corner, set up for today's ceremony. "Is everything ready?" he asked, noting how Annie kept glancing at the clock. Almost, she adjusted a stack of certificates. "I'm just nervous about my speech. I've never talked in front of so many people before." The sheriff watched as she straightened a framed news article about the program. "Just tell them what's in your heart," he advised. "That's what your mother would do." By noon, the laundromat was packed. The mayor stood near the front, along with city council members and reporters from neighboring towns. Annie's grandmother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. But most of the crowd was made up of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by the program. Seniors who'd found new independence, working parents who'd found crucial support, students who'd discovered the joy of community service. When it was time, Sheriff Thompson stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent except for the gentle whir of dryers in the background. 6 months ago, he began, I found a young girl in this laundromat, crying because she thought she couldn't help enough people. Today, I see a community transformed by that same girl's vision of what helping others could mean. He gestured to the busy space around them. This isn't just about clean clothes anymore. It's about dignity. It's about connection. It's about remembering that we all have something to give and something to receive. The sheriff turned to where Annie sat between her grandmother and Mrs. Wilson. Some people see problems and look away. Some see them and wish someone would help. But a few special people see problems and ask themselves, what can I do right now with whatever I have to make things better? Annie Brown is one of those people, just like her mother before her. He lifted a small plaque from the table. That's why today, by proclamation of the City Council, April 15th will now be known as Community Care Day in Pine Grove. And this plaque will hang here to remind us that the biggest changes often start with the smallest acts of kindness. The room erupted in applause as Annie made her way to the front. Looking out at the sea of familiar faces, Mr. Chen with his ever-present cookie container, Mrs. Wilson wiping happy tears, high school volunteers still in their sports uniforms, her grandmother holding her mother's old nursing cap, she took a deep breath. My mom used to say that helping others isn't about having a lot to give, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. It's about giving what you can, where you are, with what you have. Sometimes that means washing clothes. Sometimes it means telling stories or baking cookies or teaching someone how to fold sheets just right. She touched the small heart-shaped locket she wore, a recent gift from her grandmother containing a tiny photo of her mother. But the most important thing she taught me is that when you help others, you're never really alone. You become part of something bigger than yourself. You become part of a community. As if to prove her point, a dryer buzzed in the background, and 3 different people automatically moved to help. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the comfortable laughter of people who had become family. Sheriff Thompson watched as Annie continued her speech, describing plans for expanding the program, thanking volunteers, and sharing stories of lives changed. He remembered the lonely girl he'd found in the dark laundromat that autumn night and marveled at how far they'd all come. Outside, spring flowers bloomed in the newly installed garden boxes, a tribute to Grace Brown's love of growing things. Inside, her legacy bloomed too, in every warm smile, every helping hand, every load of laundry that represented one more person cared for, one more connection made, one more proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could wash away the biggest barriers between people.